I'm always fascinated about the interest in U.S. elections, even by non-Americans. And I thought about it, and it's obvious why. Unless America is going to go into a long period of decline, and there are people who think that, I don't actually. President of the United States is the most important official in the world, but most people in the world can't vote for him. JFK have once famously quoted a line and said, "The proudest boast of the ancient world was si vis Romanus sum." The inevitable reality of the modern world, in every way except on election day, is si vis Americanus sum. People are all profoundly impacted by what the President of the United States does and who he is, or she is, which I hope someday will happen. I'm a Democrat, but I'll try to be analytical as I look toward 2012, which is what I was asked to talk about. You know, James Carville had a famous sign in the Clinton campaign headquarters in 1992 saying, "It's the economy, stupid." And some people thought that was a message to the staff. It was actually also a message to the candidate, who liked to, every once in a while, wander off to some stop in Missouri and start talking about nuclear proliferation. And James was trying to hammer in that the only thing that mattered in that election was the economy. That's been historically true for a long time in America. In 1984, when Ronald Reagan got reelected and said it was morning in America, unemployment was about the same as it had been on the day he was inaugurated in 1981. But what had happened was that it had spiked up very high, to 10.8% higher than it's ever gone in this downturn, and it was coming down. And what mattered was the direction and the feeling people had about the economy. And the worry that if you were the Obama folks you would have is that there's a pretty clear indication that incumbents are losing now, except in places like Australia and Canada where there was virtually no recession. And they're losing even if they did respond to the global crisis in a way that may have averted turning it into a depression. I mean, for example, I think Gordon Brown played a fundamental role not only in Britain but in the world in moving to the rescue of the banking system, which if it had collapsed, we would be like as we were after the collapse of Credit Anstalt in Austria in the early 1930s, we would be in a depression. People don't reward you for not getting them into a depression. They reward you for making the economy better. And if there's a downturn, you're supposed to make it better. I think it's likely that the direction in America a year from this November will be up. People will feel it's up, and that will strengthen Obama. There's a caveat to that that I'll get to at the end. His approval is way up now, and that's in part because of the killing of Osama bin Laden. And I know there were people in Europe who hated the use of that phrase, or thought that we should have captured him. I actually believe that since we had a whole team assigned to deal with him if he was captured, that the instruction given to the SEALs was, if he throws himself on the ground and says, "I surrender," that's fine. But if he's resisting in any way, then you should kill him. And this shouldn't surprise people, even in Europe, which likes Obama a lot. He actually said during the 2008 campaign that one of his objectives was to kill Osama bin Laden. In any event, Americans like it. And it strengthened the whole notion that his leadership is powerful. And if things go decently in the economy, I think we'll look back and see it almost as a turning point, as a kind of defining moment for the Obama presidency. Now that, interestingly, is, in my view, the calculation of the strongest potential Republican candidates, which takes me to the Republican field. The Republicans with the best chance, conceivably, to win have decided not to run. They prefer a 2016 shot to the honor of losing, of winning the nomination in 2012 and then losing. There's a great line from Abraham Lincoln, who told the story of the man who was tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail, and they asked him how he felt, and he said, "If it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd rather have walked." Well, that's why I think a lot of these folks have walked away from 2012, specifically Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida, brother of the president, son of the president, who I think wants more distance between George W. Bush and his own attempt to become president, and who also thinks that Obama's likely to be reelected. Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, that I'm not going to bother to talk to you about since he's not running, and who says his family is the reason, may have had other reasons, may have had that same calculation. The governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, I think would have trouble. He's a favorite now of Republicans because he's fighting with the unions, he's fighting to cut budgets, he's pugnacious. I don't think he would carry his own state against Obama, by the way. But I think what he is most likely to do is not run for re-election in 2013. New Jersey has this odd election year. New Jersey and Virginia elect their governors the year after the presidential election. He'll not run, in my view, for re-election in 2013. Instead, will start running for president in 2016. And that way he can, all the way through his governorship, adopt policies that will help him in the National Republican Party rather than save him in the state of New Jersey. There are a couple other people like this whose names you haven't heard, most of you, but whose name you will hear at some point. John Thune from South Dakota, who's a pretty charismatic conservative Republican senator who a lot of people wanted to run. He's not running. By the way, what I'm telling you means, if I can jump ahead, that 2016 could be Bush versus Clinton again. Because I think there's a very good chance, even though she denies that she would do it, that Hillary Clinton will run. I think there's a very good chance that Jeb Bush, if Obama's reelected, will run and win the nomination. So 24 years after the first Bush-Clinton race, we could have another one, and the saga could go on for 32 years, by which time George P. Bush, the sort of young third generation or fourth generation of the family, depending on how you count it, would be old enough to run and probably would like to. Leave that scenario.
Become a monarch at that point.
Well, I mean, there is, you know, we've never done it, and somehow or other people thought that Hillary Clinton had a lock on the nomination in 2008. I think she was way ahead. I think it was a year of change when she decided to run a campaign about restoration. Obama embodied this impulse for change in America, and that's how he won the nomination against really extraordinary odds.
Well, how old Hillary will be?
69.
69.
69. But look, we have Ronald Reagan as president, who was elected when he was about that age. We had the nomination of John McCain last time, and Hillary Clinton does not look old, and I do not think she will look old in 2016. By the way, the other person who might run will be 73 years old in the Democratic Party, is Joe Biden, who also doesn't at all look, I mean, the whole sense of what age is changing. And I resemble that remark because, much to my surprise and horror, I'm going to be 68 years old this year, and you know, a long time ago, Life magazine wrote about me as a wonderkin. So that's what happens to you. You go from wonderkin to sort of has-been, I guess. Anyway, leave 2016 aside and look at the 2012 field as it is. And many Republicans see it in the way I'm probably going to describe it, which is weak and shallow. The Republican Party is very orderly, or used to be, and they always nominate by primogeniture. Whoever is the next person in line gets the nomination. Bob Dole in 1996, who was a weak candidate, but it was his turn and he got the nomination. John McCain, and I'll avert to this later, who generally went bankrupt in the middle of his 2007, in the 2008 campaign, came back and won the nomination. It was his turn. He was the next in line. Who's next in line in the Republican Party? Mitt Romney, the former governor of Massachusetts. Especially since Mike Huckabee didn't decide to run, I think it's indisputable that he's the person left out of the 2008 field who, if the traditional Republican rules held, would prevail. By the way, you might say to me, well, what about George W. Bush? Where was he next in line? He'd only been governor of Texas 6 years. He was next in line because he was almost a surrogate for his father, who people felt had been unfairly defeated in the Republican Party in 1992. Romney has three problems. One that can hurt him in the primaries and the general. He has had to renounce himself and remake his identity to satisfy the right-wing forces that now control the Republican Party. And if anybody has any doubt that very hardline conservatives, and I don't make this as a judgment, I just say it's a reality, have huge influence, all you have to do is look at what happened in Delaware in 2010, where there was a Republican Senate candidate who would have won by 20 or 30 points. And he was defeated for the nomination by a Tea Party favorite, a woman who had to announce after the primary that she wasn't a witch, and in fact did announce this on television. Romney used to be pro-choice. He used to be pro-stem cell research. He passed a health reform in Massachusetts that looks very much like the one that was passed by Obama. He is no longer pro-choice. He's totally anti-choice. He's no longer pro-stem cell. He's anti-stem cell. But to flip on the health reform individual mandate that you had to buy health insurance would have been one flip-flop too far. So he's come up with a kind of labored rationale that he believes in it, but it's a matter of states' rights, which is an old Republican and conservative rallying cry in the U.S. It's a pretty thin reed. It's not going to satisfy conservatives who are against an individual mandate, period, and I assume you all know what an individual mandate is. You have to go out. The government will provide, through a series of exchanges, a way for people to afford health insurance. If they can't afford it, they'll give them a subsidy, but then you have to buy it or you have to pay a fine. It's actually a Republican idea that was first advanced as an alternative to Hillary Care, but now Republicans are all against it, in part, I think, because Obama adopted it. Romney, it's a thin reed for these folks, for Romney, as he tries to satisfy them. It's also difficult because he said in a 2008 debate with John McCain that his health care plan should be a national model. His second problem, related to the first, is that he comes across so far as plastic and manufactured. He doesn't tend to enthuse people. That doesn't mean he can't win the nomination, but he comes across as a little, we had a cartoon years ago in the U.S., Congressman Bob Forehead, and it was a cartoon strip, and he always had every piece of hair was in exactly the right place, and he was always totally well put together, and he was always figuring out what he was supposed to say to get people to vote for him. Third, Romney, and I think you can't deny this, the fact that he is a Mormon is a problem. It's a problem oddly, it's a bigger problem in the Republican Party than it would ever be in the Democratic Party. There's a religious right base that has huge influence in the Republican nominating process. Romney is doing everything he can to appease them, but he just may not be acceptable. He's not only a Mormon, but he's a bishop in the Mormon church, which is not the same as a bishop in Italy. I mean, you can be a layman and be a bishop. But this group has a history. They used to be Democrats, by the way, before the Civil Rights Revolution, a lot of these people. But they were the people who abandoned JFK even when they were Democrats because they couldn't deal with a Catholic. They were people who had a huge amount of problem with Obama. You know, what is happening to my country? So it's not clear that he overcomes that. He will have the most money, but that may no longer necessarily be determinative. In 2004, Howard Dean spent $40 million before the Iowa caucuses. John Kerry spent about $12 million, $13 million. And Kerry won the caucuses, won New Hampshire, won the nomination. McCain, as I said to you earlier, was bankrupt in 2007. Romney had a huge money advantage, and McCain won. But in the end, the fundamental flaw for Romney could have been summed up by Ted Kennedy when they were running against each other for the Senate in 1994, and Romney said, you know, I'm a good moderate Republican, I'm pro-choice, and Kennedy said in the debate, you're not pro-choice, you're multiple choice. And I think people have that sense of it. The next first-tier candidate, and most of you will never have heard of him at all, is Tim Pawlenty, who is the ex-governor of Minnesota. He is not charismatic. He doesn't particularly have a rationale for running, except he says, I'm a regular guy. It's a kind of positioning against Romney. I came from a poor family. I had no advantages. I like to bowl. I'm a regular person. I'm very conservative. He could be what people in America call the remainder man of American politics. Sometimes someone wins because everybody else is unacceptable, and so they're the remainder man. And the religious right could decide in Iowa, where they dominate the caucuses, that he's acceptable. And if they're going to resist Romney, they could settle on Palentny. He could then come out of Iowa with his ticket punched for the finals and against whoever wins New Hampshire, where Romney is way ahead. And then Palentny could win if he defeated him in South Carolina and Florida. It's a system I think Europeans have a very hard time understanding, because in some ways, basically you go through the first two processes, Iowa and New Hampshire, and in the Democratic Party, in 2000, 2004, that was it. Gore won both, that was it. He then won every primary and caucus, by the way. And in 2008, 2000, Gore won every primary and caucus. 2004, Kerry won both Iowa and New Hampshire, and then won every primary and caucus but two, and won the nomination. In 2008, if Obama had won New Hampshire right after he'd won Iowa, that would have ended the race. The race only extended because Hillary Clinton came back and won New Hampshire. Romney is going to face a challenge in New Hampshire from another person you've never heard of, who could be the strongest Republican candidate. His name is John Huntsman. He's the former governor of Utah, Obama's ambassador to China until a month ago, and his family is one of the wealthiest families in America. His strengths in a general election, however, are weaknesses in the primary. He resembles the Bush model in 2000, and we all forget this because we look at Bush as he became, or we perceive him to have become. But in 2000, when he ran as a compassionate conservative. He took the edge off being conservative. He made himself more broadly acceptable. Huntsman is a conservative with a tinge of moderation and a patina of bipartisanship. You know, agreeing to serve as ambassador to China not only gives him a powerful national security credential, but gives him a sense of bipartisanship, that he can transcend party divisions. The GOP base that despises Obama, however, may find that utterly unacceptable. On climate change, where he was very much in favor of cap and trade, and by the way, Tim Palentny was too, and he basically groveled in the first Republican debate and said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Huntsman's come up with a more artful way out of it. He says, well, I'm not, you know, he doesn't say I'm against it in principle. He says, in the conditions of the economy right now, this isn't a good idea. I.e., when I was for it, the economy was different. We're now going to have to see what he does on civil unions for gay partnerships, which unbelievably he supported as governor of Utah, the most Mormon and in some ways one of the most conservative states in America. He too is a Mormon, but he is more casually so than Romney. He wants to run as the McCain of 2000, the kind of independent guy, conservative, but you know, somewhat moderate, reasonable. He may be forced to run as the McCain of 2008. That is, turning himself into a pretzel again to satisfy the various constituencies. Or he may decide to go ahead, be himself in 2012 and prepare for 2016. He could be a real competitor, and he could put his stake in the ground. If they nominate him, I think he would be a real competitor, although I think Obama would win. But he may be just putting his stake in the ground for 2016. There are a lot of GOP funders, and a friend of mine who's a Republican strategist has told me about this, who think that they just can't win the White House. They kind of agree with the calculations that the Bushes, the Christies, et cetera, have made, although they wouldn't admit they made them. And they may decide to focus their resources on capturing the Senate, which there are a lot more Democratic seats up than Republican seats, and taking back the House. They certainly cannot win the presidency if you get one of the other candidates. Michelle Bachmann is a Minnesota congresswoman who's a Sarah Palin clone. She went to New Hampshire and congratulated it for being the home of Lexington and Concord, the places where the American Revolution began. I mean, most 10-year-olds know that Lexington and Concord are in Massachusetts. But if either she ran or Palin, I think that would undo Palentny in Iowa. The religious right, the conservatives, the hard-shell social conservatives would tend to move toward one of them. At that point, Romney could then win Iowa and maybe New Hampshire, and the whole thing would be over. The president and his people would love to run against Palin or Bachmann or Newt Gingrich, who all had, the former Speaker of the House, you've probably seen him, you're too young, but he was a really big deal in the 90s. In some way that's his problem, he was a really big deal in the 90s.
Well, we're connected, we know the Berlusconi victory in 2001, indirectly, he doesn't know this. But if you meet him, you can tell him, Berlusconi won on a contract with Italy.
Yeah.
And he copied from...
Yeah, we used to call it the contract on America, but in any event...
On America, which is like...
But in any event, Palin, Bachmann, Gingrich have approval ratings that resemble Richard Nixon's after Watergate. So if they got nominated, they would have a very hard time getting elected. I mean, by a 2 or 3 to 1 margin, Americans say Sarah Palin is unqualified to be president of the United States. You do have Rick Santorum, the former senator from Pennsylvania, who can't get reelected in his own state, so he's running for president. And Herman Cain, the former CEO of Godfather's Pizza, who's also running in the Republican Party. Neither of them could possibly win. If they won the nomination, they certainly couldn't win the election. Even the next Republican the establishment is trying to recruit, because there's a lot of panic in the Republican establishment. Governor Rick Perry of Texas, like Romney, has extraordinary hair. He actually, and you know, you could talk about this, it doesn't look like he would present much of a threat. There's a new poll out that says only 4% of Texans would vote for him for president. Palin is in the middle of an exotic bus tour where they won't tell the press where she's going, what the next stop is, to sites all over America. She started at the Rolling Thunder motorcycle rally in Washington, went on to Gettysburg. I suspect we'll find a patriotic site in Iowa that she wants to visit along the way, although her next stop apparently is to meet Donald Trump, the real estate developer who briefly ran for president and managed to crater himself in about 2 or 3 weeks because he joined the birther conspiracy and alleged that Obama wasn't born in America, and why wouldn't he give out his birth certificate, which of course the president then did. Jon Stewart had the better answer. And you know Jon Stewart, he's a guy who runs The Daily Show, and it's the most influential news show in America for young people. It's a comedy show. And Jon Stewart said that he thought Obama should show his birth certificate as soon as Trump, who wears this ridiculous toupee, showed his real hairline. Gingrich blew himself up in the first week by criticizing Congressman Paul Ryan's Medicare proposal. And let me try to describe what it is in a very simple way. Medicare is basically a single payer system of health insurance for senior citizens, for people 65 and over. And President Kennedy campaigned for it. It passed when Johnson was president, right after Kennedy was killed. It is probably the most popular, or the second most popular program ever passed in America. But the Republicans have never liked it. They always voted against it. And so Paul Ryan came up with this proposal. He said to save Medicare. And he was going to save Medicare in much the way we saved villages in Vietnam by destroying them. He proposed that it be replaced with a voucher system under which you as a senior citizen would get a voucher for a certain amount of money. And you could then go out and negotiate with a private insurance company for health coverage. The problems, there were many problems, or there are many problems. One is that the voucher wouldn't stay anywhere near where medical inflation is. So in the end, senior citizens pretty soon would be paying an annual tax of $6,000 more a year for health insurance, except they'd be paying the tax to an insurance company, not to the government. And secondly, the Republican Party last year ran on Medicare. They told people that the health reform was going to destroy Medicare, and they had a huge advantage at the polls among seniors. It wasn't true, by the way. The changes in Medicare and the health reform were all about controlling costs within the system. They weren't about taking benefits away from people. Nonetheless, Republicans made huge gains on that, and then suddenly their most visible priority became dismembering Medicare. Well, it's no surprise that a lot of Tea Party senior citizens who joined the Tea Party on this ground, decided that they're unhappy with this. So we had a special election for Congress in New York, in upstate New York, a little over a week ago, where the Democrat won in a heavily Republican district. Why do we have a special election, by the way? Because the Republican incumbent had put pictures of himself shirtless on Craigslist, saying that he was single and was looking for some good women, and this was revealed that he was driven out of Congress. So there had to be a special election, and the whole issue was Medicare. The Republicans have dug their heels in on this, saying that they're going to do it, saying it's a way to save Medicare. I think they've almost totally lost the debate and lost it already, but they're persisting. And they're forcing presidential candidates to toe the line. The situation is such that there are some GOP consultants that think that this would cost the House, the Republicans, control of the House of Representatives if it weren't for redistricting, which would favor Republicans, and might let Democrats keep the Senate. It is certainly an issue that potentially is enormously powerful for the president going into 2012. Although it does have, we still don't have a budget for the government right now, and we have to work out a budget. And the Democrats' definition of Medicare reform is miles away from the Republican definition. Democrats' definition would be, for example, to raise the cap that you pay a tax on your earnings for Medicare, which is right now around $100,000. Maybe create a donut hole where there would be an exemption up to $200 or $250. But then make all incomes above $200 or $250 pay that tax. That would raise a lot more money for Medicare. There are a number of cost control measures that can be put in place. The Republicans want a very different thing. They basically want to privatize the whole system. This brings me to the great wild card which could throw this election up in the air. Under the guise of demanding budget cuts, the Republicans may refuse to raise the debt ceiling. We always raise the debt ceiling when we need to. Ronald Reagan raised the debt ceiling repeatedly, and he's supposedly the conservative icon. If you don't raise the debt ceiling, then you jeopardize the full faith and credit of the United States. You either don't pay Social Security, or you don't pay your soldiers, or you don't pay your bondholders. There are some Republicans in Congress who say, oh, it's not such a big deal. We could do it for 3 or 4 days. While the Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, says this would be catastrophic. It actually reminds me of the people in the Bush administration who disastrously said, it doesn't matter if Lehman Brothers goes down, it's just, one investment banking house. And of course it went down and the whole world economy went down with it, and they had to rush in and rescue every other banking house. I think we don't know the full consequences of not raising the debt ceiling, but I think it would be catastrophic. It could crater the U.S. and the global economy. As I said earlier, people don't understand, I was talking in an earlier session, people don't understand this. If you poll Americans and say, do you want to raise the debt ceiling, they say no. Well, if the answer is no, and they go to their ATMs and they can't get any money out, they're going to be very angry and very insecure. Republicans could decide, given otherwise more difficult prospects, to throw all the cards up in the air, blow up the economy, and see if Obama could be blamed. There's a danger in that. They did this in a different way, in a milder way, in 1995 when they shut down the government. And it was the Republicans who got blamed for it. And the president has an advantage in this kind of process because he has a big stage if this happens. If suddenly we don't raise the debt ceiling and the economy's in real trouble, all the cameras are going to look to the president and people are going to listen to what he has to say, and that would be a real test of his leadership. I think there are Republican leaders in the Congress who are risk averse to this, but they may also succumb to pressures in their own ranks. A friend of mine who is one of the leading lobbyists in Washington, in a firm that has both Republicans and Democrats, because they have to lobby both sides, says that some of the Republican lobbyists tell him that these new Republicans in Congress don't care whether they're reelected. In fact, they are so anti-government, they just as soon not be in the government. They went there to either downsize the government or do as much as they could to deconstruct it. So this could happen. It's a little like Barbara Tuchman's description of the Guns of August. which is the trains start rolling in one direction, you know, bringing the Russian armies toward Germany, so the Germans roll their trains, and pretty soon the whole situation's out of control and no one can stop it. Because if you start to stop, the other side might take advantage. This thing could get out of control. The trains are moving, and you could see, I believe, default on the debt ceiling. In the end, I don't think it will happen, but I think people who assume that it won't happen are wrong. By the way, the Chamber of Commerce, the Wall Street folks who support Republicans, some support Democrats, the business community almost unanimously is telling Republicans, you must raise the debt ceiling. It would be an act of fiscal lunacy not to raise the debt ceiling. I don't know. I think it'll happen. I think there will be some budget cuts. But if you ask me to map out from here to there how it's going to happen, I can't. Joe Biden's in charge of the negotiations. Maybe he has a better roadmap than I do, or maybe the president at the end will intervene and figure this out. Then, you know, if either that doesn't happen or if the Republicans get blamed for it, I would see Obama getting reelected. I would see the Republican Party, if it's beaten, perhaps forced to rethink itself. Then you would get, wouldn't become a moderate party, certainly wouldn't become a liberal party, but it would become more like the pre-Tea Party Republican Party, more like George Bush in 2000. And you could get Jeb Bush, you could get John Huntsman, if he doesn't destroy himself in the 2012 process. A lot of conservatives understand this and understand the trouble that the party is in at a presidential level right now. That's why they're searching for alternatives. But they're kind of out of alternatives. And the situation, I mean, they got these guys, see what happens. The economy could collapse, one of them could win, although I don't think Bachmann or Palin or Gingrich could win under almost any circumstances. But the situation they're in now reminds me of the old political saw when a machine politician heard complaints from party members about a slate of candidates he selected. He asked them, who the hell else you got? And the Republicans are now in that position. The real question is who the hell else they got. Anyway, I'd be happy to, that's my sense of it. I hope it's analytical and not overly partisan. I know that some Republican friends of mine share this perspective essentially, though they probably use different adjectives. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear from you guys.
Adam?
I have lots of questions, but can I start with two little ones?
Or two big ones.
Okay, or two big ones. First off, though, I do agree that you won in 2000 with war, but that's not a question. First, do you see the Tea Party momentum continuing through the 2012 elections, and how do you foresee the old school Republicans and Tea Party dynamic continuing?
Well, I think the Tea Party, there have been several Tea Party rallies recently that have been underpopulated, to put it politely. You know, they would say we're going to have thousands and thousands of people and hundreds would show up. But I think the influence of Tea Party types, if not the Tea Party itself, inside the Republican primary process will either continue to be real or will be perceived by candidates as very real. So you now have, to get off the presidential for a minute, you now have Richard Lugar, a senator from Indiana, who's been chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who has served 6 or 7 terms, being challenged by a candidate backed by Tea Party types in Indiana, and the challenger's just been endorsed by Steve Forbes. Or you have Orrin Hatch from Utah, who conservative, but over the years did a lot of work, did all the work on children's health care and insuring kids with Ted Kennedy, cooperated with Kennedy on a whole lot of other stuff, has now become, and who, by the way, was one of the originators of the idea of the individual mandate, is now terrified of a challenge in Utah from these folks, and has become almost a caricature of a conservative. It's certainly not who he used to be. All the candidates for the nomination, except maybe John Huntsman, believe that they have to satisfy these folks. Not just on most things, but on almost everything. So I see their influence in the process as being very powerful. I see their influence in the general election as massively diminished. For one thing, you're going to have a completely different electorate in the general election. The electorate was much older. I think young people will come back into the electorate in the presidential campaign. I think seniors are going to be, Republicans are not going to win seniors by 18 points. They might win seniors anyway because seniors tend to be conservative, but they'll win them by a few points, especially given what they've done with Medicare. That won't be the critical question. I mean, if the election gets close, the critical question will be what happens in a few states. Is there any possibility of Obama carrying North Carolina or Virginia again, southern states that he carried last time the Democrats haven't carried in a long time? Or even Indiana, which I think is tougher. Because if you don't carry those, or you don't pick up Colorado, which he won last time, then there's a big question. It's a question we've lived with before. Who's going to carry Ohio and Florida? Obama would only have to carry one of them. The Republican would have to carry both of them, given the way that the electoral map works. I mean, there's some states that are simply out of, I mean, California is going to vote for Obama. He has a hugely high, favorable rating. Meg Whitman just spent, I don't know, $180 million as a Republican. She was the founder of eBay, trying to become governor of California, and she got crushed by Jerry Brown. I think she, you know, she could have bought a big piece of the state. But in any event, I don't think that's the critical thing. I think the Tea Party's critical role will be in the Republican primaries. And what will matter in the general is independents, a few swing states, and then, depending on how they go, Florida and Ohio. Oh, but by the way, everybody in the Republican Party celebrated last year that they took all these governorships. Rick Scott, the new governor of Florida, who's a former HMO executive, ran a big for-profit healthcare enterprise, now has an approval rating of about 28% and a disapproval of about 60%. And that will help the Democrats in Florida next time.
The second question? No, let finish.
Yeah, there's a follow-up to this. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I can wait.
You can wait, okay, go ahead.
No, the tiny follow-up. Tea Party and religious right, they overlap entirely?
No. Everybody last year said they were very different and that the Tea Party people didn't care about social conservatism. That turned out to be completely false. I mean, we haven't talked about, before they got to the Medicare proposal, what the new Republican Congress did. It tried to defund Planned Parenthood. It tried to figure out every way it could to outlaw abortion, although it can't, because it's, at least until the Supreme Court reverses itself, it's still a constitutional right. You know, they tried to defund birth control education. I mean, all the sort of favorite social issues. Republicans have introduced legislation to repeal Obama's decision on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that will let gays serve in the military. Legislation to deny any benefits to the partners of gay couples. So it wasn't true that this was a Tea Party revolution that left the social conservative movement behind. In fact, social conservatives are very much served by the people the Tea Party helped to elect. The Tea Party, however, did have an agenda, and I believe does have an agenda, for much smaller government, much smaller federal spending, much lower taxes, and a kind of populist refusal to make the numbers add up. Because the same person in the Tea Party who, for example, was violently opposed to health reform, and this actually happened, told a congressional member of Congress at a town meeting, keep your government hands off my Medicare. I mean, no, they don't, they're not exactly the same. They overlap, but I think in the Republican primary process, they will represent what I call the hard right, that may control the nomination unless it splinters. If it splinters in Iowa, I mean, if Romney won Iowa and he hasn't even decided how much he's going to compete there, I think he'd be the nominee. Because then I think he'd win New Hampshire and be like Kerry in 2004, and it would just roll from there. But if it splinters and you got Bachmann, you got Palin, you know, so Romney can come through, and someone like Pawlenty can't win, then I think you have a whole different situation where, Lord knows who could. You know, I don't rule out someone on the far right. I mean, my friends in the Republican Party, and I do have them, are horrified at the thought of these kind of second-tier movement candidates ever being nominated for president. I mean, they want Romney or Pawlenty, or especially the McCaneites want Huntsman, or some of them want Rick Perry again. But they don't want these other folks because they think there's no way they could win and that they would do great damage congressionally. But one of them could win.
You want to go to the second?
You don't mind?
Yeah, I don't mind.
In the next, since I guess for all practical purposes, the 2012 election campaign has begun, do you feel that Obama will be constrained to make any big choices or push any bigger proposals, maybe immigration or Wall Street reform or education?
Well, that's a really interesting question because, you know, in some ways, the tragedy of the Clinton presidency, and there were many successes in the Clinton presidency, but the tragedy of it was that there was a way to get reelected in 1996 basically by disqualifying Dole and running against the government shutdown and not putting forth any big proposals. And that's what happened. And so the president won without a mandate for anything in particular. He was about to start proposing, I think, some big things, and the Lewinsky scandal came along. So he had a second term where, yes, the budget got balanced, but that was basically because of decisions that had been made before that, and where he almost achieved Middle East peace, but almost doesn't count. You know, Arafat called him on the last day of his presidency, and Clinton writes about this in his memoir and said, "I want to thank you for your efforts, you're a very great man." And Bill Clinton, who has a temper, said, "No, I am not a great man. I was going to be a great man, but your decision made sure I am not a great man," and hung up the phone. So I think it's dangerous but it's tempting but dangerous to get reelected without a mandate. I think the president will advocate immigration reform and will advocate it strongly. I don't think it will pass before the 2012 election. I think he will advocate it first because he believes in it, and secondly because it's really smart politics. The Republican Party, George Bush and understood this, and Karl Rove understood this. That's why, and this must seem like a million years ago, there was a Kennedy, McCain, Bush proposal for immigration reform. Bush understood the demographic power of increasing Hispanic population, so did Rove. The only reason he got reelected in 2004 was he got 44% of the Hispanic vote. And at this point, you have to get 40% as a Republican, or you can't get elected. But there's so much anger from these same folks that we were just talking about in the Republican Party that Republicans can't be for any kind of immigration reform other than, you know, control the borders and throw these people out. Throw these people out is ridiculous. We need to put 13 million people on buses and send them where? And also there'd be a lot of places where economies would actually collapse if you got rid of all the immigrants. So I think the president will push it because he believes in it, but he'll also push it because he understands that the Republican Party is committing long-term demographic suicide. I mean, you know, I see Texas, your state, in maybe 10 years, maybe if he got really lucky sooner, maybe if Obama has a lot of money and really brought in a lot of Hispanic voters and brought them to the polls. But in 10 years, I see Texas becoming much more like California. California was a pretty reliably Republican state, and then in presidential elections. And then in 1994, Governor Pete Wilson wanted to get reelected. So he sponsored something called Proposition 211, which basically said that not only illegal immigrants, but their children would be denied basic public services. They couldn't go to school, they would be denied health services, etc. This thing passed, by the way. Hispanics were infuriated. It was struck down by the courts. And except for Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's hardly a conventional Republican, they can't win a statewide election. And I think the same process that went on in California, and they certainly can't carry California to the presidency, could ultimately go on in Texas, where the Hispanic population is, I think, up to something like 30 or 35% now. So I think he'll push immigration reform. He is pushing education. For some reason that I've never, I think I do understand it actually, but the president's pushing education. It doesn't get a lot of traction, and yet it is the single most important issue right now for the American economy. And maybe he has the gifts to dramatize this. The new markets that we're going to have to sell to, and that Italy is going to have to sell to in Europe, to have any kind of sustained and robust recovery, are the new markets that are emerging in Asia, where you're going to have 1 billion to 2 billion new middle-class consumers over the next 10 years. That means they're going to do a lot of jobs that are now done by people here, or less and less done by people here. So you've got to educate people for the new economy, where the US and Europe are going to do very different things, although there will be manufacturing, by the way. There's a big manufacturing rebound in the US. But it'll be specialized high-end manufacturing. And you've got to have continuing education so that you retool workers for the jobs that are there. And that, it just never has been sexy to people. Healthcare has been sexy to people, or repulsive, depending on your perspective. But the whole education issue has never had the same power, and the Republicans are fixated. Right after they dismember Medicare, a lot of them would like to dismember the public school system by giving people vouchers to pay for private schools and basically privatizing the educational process. But I think Obama will put some big ideas on the table.
Can I join just to bring also to foreign policy question?
Sure.
The first question is there any general understanding between the various Republican candidates of what America should do? So there is a Republican foreign policy differently interpreted, or you have very different Republican foreign policy according to the candidate? Of course, we know that foreign policy is not a crucial issue in American foreign policy, but in any way, the implications are very. The second question is there any interest in the Obama administration to push for the Palestinian-Israeli agreement, or rather is safer for Obama to keep distance from that agreement, because at the very end the risk to lose the Jews vote in very important states?
Well, first, let me answer them in reversed order.
Okay.
I'll give at least my answer. First, it is safer to avoid the issue. To his credit, Obama has not. In fact, he gave a very controversial speech a couple of weeks ago where he said there has to be a peace settlement based on the 1967 borders with land swaps. Now, that basically, by the way, is the agreement that Clinton and Ehud Barak offered to Arafat and that he turned down in 2000 and early 2001. And also, I was involved in Ehud Barak's campaigns. He's now defense minister in the Netanyahu government, so he may have changed his mind. But he told me then that was the only basis on which there would ever be a peace agreement. It was fundamentally the outline. And by the way, it's been American policy, although not stated quite that explicitly, from at least George H.W. Bush Sr. on. And George W. Bush and Ariel Sharon, sort of a hawk converted to the idea that you had to make an agreement, were proceeding on this basis. I quarrel with one premise, and I think it's a stereotype about America that's wrong. There is no monolithic Jewish community that automatically agrees with everything that every Israeli government does. In fact, I think there are a lot of people in the Jewish community in America who are in accord with what the president said, think that Netanyahu has been anywhere from lax, and I believe that's a mild description, to inimical to the peace process, and who will not be put off by the president doing this at all. One thing in fairness we ought to say, by the way, and maybe you can argue about how this happened, it is going to be hard to negotiate this thing under any circumstances. It's impossible to ask Israel to negotiate with Hamas as part of the government of the Palestinian Authority if Hamas says, we don't recognize your right to exist and we want to throw you into the sea. I mean, the one thing the PLO did that led to 92 and then to all the agreements that came after that was the PLO said we recognize the right of Israel to exist. So look, the president got 75, maybe 80% of the Jewish vote, if you want to call it Jewish vote last time. I think he will carry a very heavy percentage of American Jews, and I think he's been pretty brave on the peace process. If your deeper question is, do I have a lot of optimism that it's going to move forward in the next year, year and a half? No, I don't. First of all, the Israeli Prime Minister basically has the entire Republican Party saying to him, we're with you and whatever you want, we'll do, because it's, you know, what was Romney's line? Obama threw Israel under the bus. I mean, it's not true, but it suggests a political opportunism involved here. I think the difference on foreign policy, there are specific differences, and they're not all uniform in the Republican Party. There's some people in the Republican Party who think that we shouldn't be in Libya at all. John McCain thinks that the U.S. should have been in there full force, not with NATO. But the one thing I would say that characterizes a big difference, and it's thematic between the two parties, is Democrats tend to see American exceptionalism, and I think there is something truly exceptional about America, as rooted in ideals and values, but not ruling out working with other people, listening to other people, cooperating with other people. And in fact, Obama's done an extraordinary job of rebuilding alliances and relationships in the world. Republicans tend to see American exceptionalism as almost a pugnacious, go it alone, we're going to do what we want, and people can either come with us or not. And exceptionalism is now one of the favorite words that you hear from Republican candidates or possible candidates. Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich, Romney's talked about it, Pawlenty talks about it. And I think exceptionalism, I have this theory that I was discussing earlier, that a lot of American political communication is coded. And I think the word exceptionalism means we're always right, they're always wrong, and we're going to do it our way. For Republicans, that's what I think it means. For Democrats, I think it means that America not only has a special place, but has a special responsibility, and that involves dealing with other countries. So if there's any opening, if something bad happens, you'll see Republicans ganging up on it and saying, we would have done it differently, we wouldn't have waited to listen to Britain, we wouldn't have listened to NATO, we would have just gone ahead and done it, which of course is what they did in Iraq, and that was a hell of a success. Anyway.
Please? Please.
I was wondering about unemployment. Do you think that in this further campaign it's going to be one of the main targets?
Yeah, I think unemployment. Sure, I think the Republicans are going to say, you know, unemployment is really high, and I think Obama's going to say it's coming down, and Bush caused this huge deep recession, and we responded to it. And I don't think those arguments will, in the end, be judged on the merits, because I know what I think of the merits of the arguments. I think they'll be judged on the feeling inside the electorate about what the direction of the economy is. You know, the administration in the first 2 years, and they've stopped saying this now, they can only say it when people feel things are getting better, kept saying, well, the president's policy saved 2 million, 4 million, 6 million jobs. You know the problem with that argument? If your job was saved, you don't know it. No one ever walked in and said, by the way, if it hadn't been for what Obama did, we were going to fire you. I mean, the economies don't work that way. So you need robust job creation. We're going to see what the figures are this Friday. They'll come out this Friday. Last month was like 250,000 private sector jobs. One thing that's happening, by the way, is as states and localities cut back, they're laying people off. So a net of 250 or 270,000 private sector jobs becomes, in the overall economy, you know, 200,000, 220, 230,000 as states lay people off. But yeah, I think it'll be a big argument. Now, the one thing that in an ideal world, someone of my political persuasion would like to do would be to continue more stimulative policies for a longer period of time. But there's no way to do that. There are no votes in Congress for doing that. The president can't get away with it. That's why I think, despite a lot of liberal dissatisfaction, he made a pretty smart deal in December when he agreed to extend the Bush tax rates for 2 years, Bush tax cuts for 2 years, and in return got extended unemployment compensation and some other tax provisions that help middle-income families and put more money into the economy. Now, the Republicans would like to roll that back, not by taking away the tax cuts, but by massive cuts in government spending and government benefits. But the big issue, it's like with Reagan, you know, 7.2 to 7.4% unemployment when he became president, 7.2 to 7.4% unemployment when he carried 49 of 50 states. But people felt that things are getting better because they'd gotten a lot worse. They'd gone up, as I said, to 10.8%, the highest figure in America since the Depression, and was not topped in this recession. There are a lot of cliches about this and about how it applies in America. Let me give you an example, and I'll use JFK. Everybody says, well, you know, people who listened to the first Kennedy-Nixon debate on the radio thought that Nixon won, and people who watched it on television thought Kennedy won, and so it must all be image. And when I first heard this years and years and years ago, I used to be a college debater. I sat down, a couple of friends of mine sat down, and we went through the debate, and we flowed it the way you would flow a college debate, who's winning the arguments. Now, Kennedy was winning the big thematic things, but who's winning the arguments? And we all thought Kennedy was, and then I thought some more about it. Okay, you're having the first presidential debate in American history that's being televised. First presidential debate, period. First one being televised. Why would you listen to it on the radio? You would listen to it on the radio because you didn't have a television or didn't have access to television coverage, and we didn't have cable TV in those days. So who didn't have access to television coverage? A lot of people in the rural South, where there was huge Protestant resistance to the Kennedy candidacy. A lot of people in the rural West that were predisposed toward Nixon. And someday I would actually like to get the money to do this on a research basis, but I think if you controlled for that, you would find that this is another one of those pieces of street common wisdom that's completely wrong. That people actually listened to the debate, and they said, yeah, but what I think happened in that debate, by the way, was they listened to the debate. Nixon was running on the slogan of experience. They watched Kennedy side by side with Nixon, and they said, experience, footnote, experience in my view is not a binary question. That is, you could have two candidates with experience. So they watched the debate, and they say, oh, Kennedy has enough experience. If he can stand up to Nixon, he can be president. I can trust him, and I think that's the big story of that debate, actually. Finally, the picture on Hillary Clinton, I don't know whether this is factually true or not. I could understand if she had that reaction. I think women bear a special burden in politics, which was one of the things that I think hurt her in 2008. Her best moment, actually, was when she was fully herself the morning before the New Hampshire primary, and she cried, and some people on her staff thought it was a catastrophe, and I think it played a critical role in letting people see her as a human being, and in turning that primary around, which she won very narrowly when people thought Obama was going to win. But she had this big consciousness in 2008 that she had to look tough, that no woman was going to get elected unless they looked tough. So that may reflect that. Do I think that picture will have any impact on her political career? None. I think she will finish as Secretary of State at or near the end of the first term, assuming Obama has a second term. And then my bet, and I could be completely wrong, my bet is that she'll run for president in 2016. And I think she would have a very good chance of being the Democratic nominee and a pretty good chance of being president. I don't know how a Clinton-Biden showdown would shake out, but in a way, if they both ran, I think she would have the clear advantage to start with. Now, she had the clear advantage last time to start with. Yes, sir.
Short question.
And I'll give shorter answers, I'm sorry.
Because we have...
Professor SHRUM, how important are social networks for the Obama campaign?
Fundamental, life-giving, life-sustaining. Kerry I fought very hard inside the Kerry campaign in 2004 to have us not take federal funding for the general election because we had to make it last 13 weeks and Bush, whose convention was much later, would have to make it last only 5 weeks. We had raised, Howard Dean had started the internet thing. We picked it up and raised an enormous amount of money on the internet before the convention. In fact, in about 5 seconds of the acceptance speech, you know, when Kerry said, I'm now going to say something to you that Franklin Roosevelt never could, go to johnkerry.com. And millions of people went to johnkerry.com and gave us money. So I said, we should not take the federal funding. And Obama made, and he took grief for it, because he said at first, I'm going to take the federal funding. And then he understood the history, and he said, I'm not taking the federal funding. And I think that that's not sustainable just with big givers. It's got to be sustained by the grassroots and the internet. And I think it's possible that Obama will run the first billion-dollar presidential campaign. Oddly, much of it fueled by pretty small individual donations.
Chief,
Yeah.
she was before you.
Thank you very much. First, because it is very, very interesting. I took note of some dedicated words you used during your speech because I think that they are fundamental, like persuasion, like exceptionalism, smart politics. Because I think that they are very, very, very important topics in a political campaign. But my question is, especially for Obama, with the president in the run to be re-elected as president once more, how long do you think that political persuasion can last? And where can the concrete facts replace the persuasion? I mean, because I think that I think that the electors are the Americans, so the Americans will be able to understand and to make the difference between the political persuasion and the facts, the concrete facts, because the facts are their life.
Are you thinking of Berlusconi?
No. This is not a joke, but I think that it's fundamental. No.
Persuasion sometimes fails. The president in 2010, campaigning for Democrats, went out and said, why would you want to give the control of the car back to the people who drove it into the ditch? You know, Bush caused this, we're getting out of it. And people kept saying, you know, maybe all that's true, but we elected you to fix it. And you're telling me things are getting better, but my neighbor down the street lost his job. And, you know, the value of the houses down the street are underwater, and my retirement savings aren't worth anything. So I think there was a collision of facts and persuasion there, and the Republicans had the advantage. If that were the case next year and they nominated a reasonable person, I think they could win. But I don't think that will be the case next year. And I think they're going to put all of their candidates through hoops that are going to make them seem less presidential. As a more general answer to what you're saying, I believe persuasion, and this I teach a course about this actually in graduate school, I believe persuasion ultimately has to be consistent with the facts. It doesn't in the first moment. It doesn't the first time around. But, you know, look, Herbert Hoover in the Depression basically adopted the policies that you're now seeing adopted in a lot of places like Britain. You know, we got to restrain federal spending, et cetera. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt promised to cut the budget 25% and did exactly the opposite once he came into office. But people didn't care in 1936 when they said, you know, Roosevelt's spending too much money and the deficit is too big and all of that, because they felt their lives were getting better in their own real lives. So what had then been a shibboleth and has since become one, that it's always better to spend less, always good to balance the budget, just ran up against reality and people rejected it. You know, in Britain right now, you have big cutbacks, and the economy basically stalled in the fourth quarter and hardly grew in the first quarter. So we'll see what happens from here.
Roberto.
I would like to ask you that before this your talk, I thought that Obama had a good chance to win. After you talk, I think Obama will win. It seems to me that the facts that you present make it pretty clear that the outcome of the 2012 election was my question is about Obama's second term. What do you think he will do about, in his second term and last term, about some of the fundamental problems that the U.S. is facing? I'm thinking the debt, the deficits, and other big issues, including, for example, the Palestinian issues. It's a question that you raised before. You know, with 4 years ahead, the point is he has 4 years ahead that he can really use to do something, to leave a legacy. What his legacy will be?
Well, right now, before a second term, I think he has has a very impressive legacy, more than a lot of people who served 2 terms as president. In terms of health reform, financial reform, helping to save the world economy from going off the cliff, a whole set of things that he's done, including, with things we're not even talking about, like getting the START Treaty ratified when there was huge political advantage with a lot of Republicans thought not doing it. He actually already has an idea of what he wants to do about debt and deficits, has had it, I think, all along, and it's been that we need a kind of short-term, some deficit reduction, medium-term, sharper deficit reduction as the economy gets stronger, and long-term, pretty deep deficit reduction. And I think he probably is willing to talk about changes in entitlement programs. But he's not going to be willing to talk about turning entitlement programs into privatized, contracted out pieces of a safety net that a lot of people are going to fall through. If he gets reelected, hopefully he will have some of the political capital to get that done, but you have to be very careful. Bush got reelected, although only by a little wee bit. Like say, the football stadium where the people in Ohio would change their minds, he wouldn't have had a second term. But he took it as a mandate and proposed kind of a privatization of Social Security, and it got utterly destroyed. It was dead before he finished talking about it. The one thing I'd say about the Palestinian issue is, and I've taught in the Arab world, or at least in the United Arab Emirates, and I worked on 2 Israeli campaigns in '99, which was the one of great hope, when Ehud Barak won by a huge margin. 300,000 people showed up in Rabin Square spontaneously. In 2001, when he called me and said, "Can you come and work on the campaign? I'm going to lose." And I said, yes. There's an illusion, I think, in Europe that somehow or other the United States, by itself, can impose a peace agreement. I don't agree with that. I think there will have to be the emergence of a view in Israel that not making peace is more expensive and more dangerous for the country than making peace. You've got, and on not to speak of the Palestinian side, where people have to give up ridiculous illusions. I'll give you an example. The right of return. Now, the right of return is a recipe for Israeli suicide. Everybody who ever had an ancestor who lived in Israel will take their old keys, which don't open any doors now, by the way, and go back and say, I can live here. Demographically, that's a disaster. The Israelis will never agree to it. They wouldn't agree to it in 2000. I think Clinton thought the answer to this was economic compensation. And I think that is the answer. So the Palestinians have to come to accept Israel, which some of them do and some of them don't, or at least say they do and some say they don't. And they have to get realistic too. They're not getting back the whole old city. I mean, Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton were basically offering them about half of the old city, including the top of the Temple Mount, or what they call the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. And that's what they can get. But on the other hand, the Israelis have to sort of accept the fact that their security does not require them to control the Dome of the Rock and the Arab quarter of the old city. But I don't believe the U.S. can impose this. I think Obama, by the way, you left out a couple of things. I think Obama will get very serious about energy in a second term. And I think we're going to stop calling it climate change, even though there is climate change. All you have to do is be around here the last few weeks or be in New York this winter. And I think there will be a huge effort to invest in alternative energies, and at the same time to increase domestic production of energy. You know, we didn't even talk about it, but one of the most consequential things that's happened in the world in the last few weeks is Germany's decision to renounce nuclear power. Germany says all nuclear power production will cease in this country by 2022. We're going to invest in solar, wind, and tidal or water power. And that will put more pressure on oil supplies, but it's also a very big decision because a big part of, even many in the environmental movement in the US, a big part of their plan for the future has been an expansion of nuclear power. That'll be one of the big decisions to be made. The problem with nuclear power has always been that it's very expensive to build one of these plants. And you can put trillions of dollars into nuclear plant technology. And then if you have a meltdown, as we've just seen, in one plant, everybody says, oh my God, we have to close this down. Now, it didn't happen in the US after 3 Mile Island, but what did happen was we didn't build any new nuclear power plants. And now Germany has said we're not only going to build no nuclear power plants, new ones, we're going to close down the ones that exist. This from a CDU government in Germany, it's extraordinary.
Okay, I think that we are finished our discussion. Please join me in applauding Bob. Very nice discussion.
And if you ever want to read my opinions, informed or ill-informed, sometimes I don't write about politics, but I write a lot about it. It's on theweek.com. I write a column every week.